So we remember that Rumi taught us that our task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within ourselves that we have built against it. And that sounds intense, but good. So far, so good. So what happens once we find the barriers? What do we do when we find these barriers in ourselves that we've built against the awakening presence? Here's a clue from another tradition, from the Gospel of Thomas, which is a collection of the esoteric teachings of Jesus found in the Nag Hammadi library, this set of scrolls that were discovered. And in the text, he says this: "Those who seek should not stop seeking until they find." Okay, so far so good. We're finding those barriers. Then he continues, "When they find, they will be disturbed. And when they are disturbed, they will marvel and then rule over all." So let's decode this. In our practice of letting go of the barriers, we're going to get to those barriers, those beliefs, those identity structures that we have built, that ourselves, inside of ourselves, that block us from fully realizing, embodying, and expressing the radiance that is true nature. And when we find it, there's the obstacle, there's the barrier. The master is saying, we're disturbed. That wasn't exactly what I had in mind, right? That wasn't the plan. Jesus is explaining that we should go towards what we seek, definitely. Not because it will bring us to our imagined salvation, the salvation we constructed from our conditioning to get us away from our suffering, but because we will be brought face to face with that which we have tried so hard not to look at, that which we had hoped that the spiritual path might help us to get away from or avoid. You know, it's a natural impulse. We come to the teachings hoping for a special dispensation, a loophole perhaps in the cosmic contract, some kind of commuter bypass loop that's going to take us around the city of our confusion and avoid all the traffic of our karma. But that's not how the path unfolds. It's not a bypass. It's not a spiritual bypass. Following the path takes us back back to the core. And in the core, we remember deeply, yes, there is the radiance. But before we can enter the temple of the radiance, we must meet the barriers that we have constructed. In all the ancient temples, of course, over the doorway, there's some kind of face of glory, it's called, a horrifying visage, a protector, it's sometimes called. And it's there to call out all of our fears, and it's there to purify our mind of all of our false hopes and all of our avoidance. And it does this refining and this releasing and this blessing of our emotional reactivity as a prerequisite for entering the temple. But seeing the face of glory, which is the face of our own unredeemed emotional patterns, is disturbing. Seeing the patterns can bring up all kinds of disturbing emotions and self-judgments, right? Judgments maybe that we had previously projected onto others. That they were too fearful, too dependent, maybe too controlling, too rigid, too insisting that they are right, too naive maybe, or angry, all these things, too negative, or maybe they're just too positive, too self-centered, too sacrificing. All these polarities that we project part of onto the other. But the disturbing nature of the path brings us back to look into the magic mirror, the face of glory, to see that which we have not wanted to see. In Sanskrit, and there's a word called samvega. It's also a word in Pali, and it became a very important word in the development of Buddhism, samvega. And it translates to tremble or to move, to be agitated. Sounds a lot like the disturbing word, right? Sometimes it's translated simply as fear, but it's really this trembling that occurs. And I'm reminded of the biblical phrase also that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. But this is a trembling, a fear of our own innate goodness, and the contrast between that and what we see in our shadow material. In the story of the Buddha, samvega is the word that is used to describe the emotion that the Buddha to be, Prince Siddhartha, experienced when he saw the 4 signs, of old age, sickness, death, and renunciation. And the feeling is, there's no English word really to describe it. It has 3 main qualities of this disturbance. One is the disturbing shock and the dismay, even the alienation that comes when we realize we have been living a sleeping life, a conditioned life. We're living in a conditioned cycle of repetitive emotional reactivity. That's disturbing. And the second quality of this disturbing is a little deeper. It's to we see also that we have been complacent and even complicit in perpetuating this karmic sleepwalking way of living. And the third quality is a sense of urgency, a kind of fiery waking up, which is a healthy kind of urgency, that there's an urgency within us to realize, to embody, to express a way of living that will be liberational for ourselves and for others, that will transform conditioning into awakened consciousness. So this is the disturbing moment. And if we can open to it, if we can receive the samvega transmission, it will be motivating and it will move us into what's called the sacred fire. It will move us into what's called in yoga the tapas, the purifying fire, which you find all around the world. It's really the fire that flows through close to the central channel of our being as the currents of rationality and emotionality as the projections begin to vibrate and be drawn together. There's a heat that rises in the system organically, naturally. It's like this hot springs that pre-COVID and pre-fire season, which burned it up. We used to go to this hot springs in Northern California that had this one bath that was so hot. And when you first put your foot in, the entire nervous system was basically screaming and saying, "Get me out of here." And that is the natural response to the disturbance that Jesus is pointing us towards. When we turn around in consciousness and see the projections, and we see the ways that we've been complicit in our own suffering and the suffering of others in the conditioned life, there's a natural response in the nervous system to pull away, or to pull away, but to pull away in the form of doing something to make it go away. And this is what perpetuates the sleeping life. When we feel the heat of that purifying, disturbing fire, our task is to be still, to be still, to let the fire do its work. It's a burning awareness. It's natural. It's a burning awareness that is purifying the identification with incompleteness. It's burning up the mental models of constriction and contraction. It's purifying the emotional programs and the beliefs. And there can be this sense, it's like the phrase, it's too hot to handle. And the answer is, it is too hot for the conditioned identity, for the old patterns of being to handle. Thankfully, it's too hot for them to handle. This is really the grace of the fire, that it's too hot. It's going to burn up the old belief systems, worldviews, and structures of identity. And there's nothing to do except assent, A-S-S-E-N-T, say yes to that. And to be still and to allow it to do its work at the pace of integration. As we stay steady and as we cultivate our capacity to be still in the face of the disturbance, the outmoded images, self-images, other images, world images, those are all burned away. And we begin to see and feel and know, I'm not my images, you're not your images. They're not my images of them. The world isn't my image. And that the fire is liberational. That burning is liberating and healing. And this brings us to the second part of the syntax that Jesus pointed out when he said, you will marvel. You will marvel. Those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. Now you are staying still in the disturbance. And then they will marvel. As the fixations and the projections are purified, there is a radiance of being that barks in our ear over here, but it shines through. It's shining through. The dogs are all barking. They're all marveling at the radiance that's shining through. Simply, beautifully, and with clarity, breath by breath. As the projections are released, as the tangled karmic identities and narratives are unwound, what is revealed, Thomas Burton called it the hidden wholeness. The Tibetan Buddhists call it the innate goodness. In Kriya Yoga, we call it the radiance within. That has always been there. And this is the marvel, the awe. In Sanskrit, this awe as a felt sense is given the word Ananda. Ananda, Ananda, Ananda. It's the bliss of being, coming back to your true name, to your true self, to life's heart. There's Ananda, waves of blissfulness, is the feeling tone of that radiance pulsing through your being and through all of life. It's Anandic bliss, and it brings to mind the mantra, if we can call it that, from the book of Genesis. You remember in the creation story, when the radiant generative presence known as the Lord emanates forth waves of creation, the day, the night, the sea, the earth, and looks at each one and has an experience of self-recognition in the mirror of creation. And this presence says, it is good. It is good. There's this recognition of innate goodness, and that is the marveling, the blissful marveling. And it brings out a natural impulse to continue to unfold creativity. And now here's where it gets interesting. Jesus says, after that marveling, we will rule over all. It's a funny translation. It's not got the connotation of rulership in the sense of dominating or controlling. It's probably more akin to the idea of mastery or being a maestro, which is that the maestro is completely, you could say, in control of the instrument and the music, but not in a controlling way, rather in a way that is all about service and stewardship and bringing forth the goodness that is embedded and coded in every note of the music. And so the marveling leads us to this sense of participatory mastery, where we continue to refine our instrument of body, mind, and speech, so that we can, with our very life, become a vehicle of the music of the radiance, of the innate bliss, and express it through our unique music and manifestation, and to whatever arises, whether it appears internally or externally, to see through the surface form into the goodness itself, and as a steward of that goodness, call it forth, whether it's in our children and our family, other family members, our co-workers, whether it's in our community, people, events, and things that arise in the field of our consciousness are now seen as not barriers, but as divine messengers, reminding us there is a natural syntax to the awakening process. Those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. Let's be still. And when we are fully disturbed without resistance, we will marvel. We will be feeling the innate bliss that will arise, and we will become the compassionate stewards of all that we meet.